to everybody. First, I would like to thank you all for gathering here today. I hope that you will all have a pleasant stay in Ljubljana and that you will find the days ahead rewarding, let us say, both intellectually and socially. And I strongly believe that this prospect is a realistic one, since as far as I can see, all the necessary conditions, that is, you, are present. But my special thanks go to Bojana, who launched the idea to organize something, it was said at the beginning, on Hegel's concept of singularity. She acted as the driving force behind the project all along, and together with Martin here, did the necessary yet often unnoticed work to make it happen. So thank you both. Finally, I must say that I mean it, basically, honored to open with my dear friend Yorgos this workshop on Hegel's Einzelheit. Our task here is, as I understand it, to provide a preliminary overview of the corresponding conceptual landscape, to sketch up, let us say, the map of the problem, to mark the issues it engages with, and so on. And I will try to do, according to my limited abilities, without any pretension to systematicity or exhaustiveness, just to open the field for discussion. For our gathering, and I find this very important, is actually conceived as a workshop. This is as a place for an open, productive discussion where different, not necessarily, let us say, polished views can be exchanged and tried in a dedicated, but also, I hope, no, I'm sure, friendly intellectual environment. So, singularity in Hegel. Hegel is often perceived as a philosopher of the universal. It is therefore no coincidence that his critics, from Kierkegaard to Deleuze, presented themselves as advocates of singularity. Hegel, they claimed, was unable to grasp the singular. His philosophical system rather served as a giant logical device to force it into the straitjacket of the universal. And now it is interesting to know that there is something in Hegel that corroborates this view. Especially that early Jena Hegel seems to corroborate this picture perfectly, actually. For instance, in his essay on common sense, Hegel derided Krug, who challenged philosophy to deduce the pen he was writing with. But more importantly, in a passage from the unpublished essay on the system of ethical life, System der Sittlichkeit, written in the fall 1802, Hegel openly discards the relevance of the singular on both metaphysical and political levels. Okay, I will continue. I will read it in English nevertheless. I quote, "In the ethical life, the individual exists in an eternal mode. His empirical being and doing is something downright universal. For it is not the individual which acts, but the universal absolute spirit in him. Philosophy's view of the world and necessity, according to which all things are in God, and there is nothing singular, is perfectly realized for the empirical consciousness, since every singularity of action or thought or being has its essence and meaning simply and solely in the whole." In this remarkable passage, I do not think Hegel is being ironic with rejecting singularity downright. We must recall that in this period he acted as a supporter of his famous philosophical friend Schelling, and that according to the latter's philosophy of identity, heavily marked by Spinoza, finite things do not truly exist. To know something as it truly is, Schelling claims, is to know it as identical with the absolute, as identity itself, E equal E, A equal A, with no particular determination on its own. So we can rather safely assume that philosophy's view of the world, according to which there is nothing singular that Hegel is talking about here, actually corresponds to his own view at that time. Along the similar lines, Hegel also praises the ethical life in which particularity is completely annihilated, and the individual's empirical consciousness is one with the absolute consciousness. These are the quotes. It may come as a surprise that Hegel relates this absolute identity of intelligence, his expression, to the beautiful ethical life of the Greeks, which, from the early years on, he has admired as an unsurpassable political ideal. The Greek comparison, strange at first sight, however, is not misplaced at all. What Hegel was attracted by in this beautiful world was that in the Greek polis, every individual, meaning, of course, every male free citizen, was animated by the spirit of community, so that his particularity immediately and completely coincided with the universal. I quote, "In public as in private and domestic life, every individual lived by his own laws, not in defiance, meaning not in defiance of the state laws, but because the state was," I quote, "the final end of his world, or in his eyes, the final end of the world." This is from a fragment in 96. Confronted by this idea, Hegel concluded his own individuality vanished. There was no place for the singular in Greek polis. Hegel was aware that the beautiful ethical life of the Greeks was gone forever. However, in his difference essay from 1801, he still praised the true infinity of a beautiful community, implicitly referring to the Greek ethical life. And in the essay on natural right, late 1802, he still tried to reconstruct the lost coincidence of the universal and individual. Everything suggests then that the parallel drawn in the system of ethical life between Spinoza and Schelling on the one hand and the Greeks on the other was meant to be affirmative for Hegel. Thus we can say that in 1802, in both metaphysics and political philosophy, Hegel's position consisted in dismissing independent singularity, in dissolving the particular into the universal. And what is important in my view is that in a very short time, Hegel's view changed completely. In what may be described as the most significant turn in his intellectual biography, Hegel distanced himself from Schelling's Spinozian metaphysics of one substance and from the beautiful ethical world of the Greeks, both. In the preface to the Phenomenology, Hegel now denounces Schelling's absolute as the night on which all cows are black, calling his philosophy absolute einfarbige Malerei. Hegel famously declares that in his view, it is of decisive importance that the true is grasped not as substance, but equally as subject. Later writings reveal that Hegel now basically objects to Spinoza that his metaphysical system does not allow for the existence of finite things. Spinoza's absolute substance is like an, I quote, abyss into which all determinateness has been cast and destroyed. What is missing, Hegel continues, is the progression of the absolute to the inessentiality, a transition from itself to an understanding and a singular. This is what is missing in Hegel, in Spinoza. In particular, Hegel complains that Spinoza's substance, I quote, lacks the principle of personality, which is the self-determining source of all life and movement. This is then one shift. And a parallel shift occurred in his political theory as well. Hegel now notices that the Greek polis was not only beautiful, but also extremely fragile. As soon as a subject appeared in its midst, a subject that was prepared to insist on her particularity to the very end, as was the case with Antigone, the beautiful community was bound to perish. In his system draft from 1805, Hegel repudiates the beautiful, happy freedom of the Greeks. This is now rejected, emphasizing that it is precisely this complete oneness of the individual and the universal that led to its inevitable demise. The state is gone, Hegel argues, because it lacked the principle of absolute singularity. This was the reason of the demise of the beautiful Greek ethical life. Accordingly, he no longer laments the loss of immediate harmony of the modern ethical world and no longer wants to prevent the separation that marks it. Quite the contrary, he now explicitly calls for an even, he says, higher abstraction, for a greater opposition, and a higher divide in which one knows, I quote, oneself as the essence, unquote, and although, I quote, separated from the existing universal, is still absolute. This is the formula, separated from the existing universal being still absolute. Hegel now comes to realize that in the modern world, ethical life can only be rebuilt based on the principle of subjective particularity, not in opposition to it. In both metaphysics and political theory, Hegel's distancing himself from Schelling and Spinoza coincided with his affirmation of an independent singularity against the absolute substance. Indeed, as it was precisely through this shift, through this rupture, that his mature philosophical standpoint was finally formed, Hegel, I think, can be convincingly labeled a philosopher of the singular, a philosopher that in both his metaphysics and ethical theory defended the right of singularity. Let me add that while the reasons for this fundamental shift are still not sufficiently explained, to my knowledge, one of the authors prompting it could well have been Spinoza, I think. One line of influence could have come from the Tractatus Politicus, which Hegel probably read in 1802 in the context of Paulus' edition. Another could have been related to Spinoza's project of intuitive science that is supposed to grasp the inner essence of the things and refers precisely to res singulares. And I think that there is an interesting gradation in the three kinds of cognition in Spinoza: imaginatio, ratio, scientia intuitiva on the one hand, and Vorstellung, Gedanke und Begriff in Hegel. And this is explicitly presented in the introduction, in this very period, in the introduction to the phenomenology. So I think that this connection is actually strong, but I cannot go in details here. And one more thing, imaginatio. What was Hegel's translation for imaginatio into German? Vorstellung. So it is even linguistically a strong connection. But okay, this is a subject for another discussion. After this brief overview of the changing fortunes of the concept of singularity in Hegel's formative years, especially in his ambiguous relation to Spinoza, let's now consider his mature treatment of the subject of singularity. As we have seen, the programmatic declaration on substance and subject can be read as a call to overcome the limitations of Spinozist substantial metaphysics, which does not allow for the existence of finite things in general and self-determining subjects in particular. Moreover, the formulation itself suggests that this overcoming cannot consist in simply replacing substance with subject or pitting one against the other, but must acknowledge the right of both substance and subject. In the science of logic, the speculative core of Hegel's philosophy, this immanent overcoming occurs as a transition from objective to subjective logic, more precisely, from the concept of substance to the concept of the concept. So, substance, concept. Accordingly, I will first present Hegel's exposition of the concept as a privileged model to articulate substance and subject, the universal and the singular, and then its modifications in the field of ethical life or political theory. And for the sake of brevity, since this is an introduction, I will proceed schematically without a proper justification. So, first, singularity in Hegel's concept. In Hegel, we said the concept inherits the legacy of substance as the place of the ultimate explanation and complete intelligibility. It is the name of a self-determining logical structure in which self-identity, called universality here, and self-negativity, that is singularity, are mediated through determinacy, here particularity. What allows the concept to think what at the standpoint of substance proved unthinkable, that is, what allows the concept to succeed while the substance failed, the concept of the concept succeed when where the concept of substance failed, is the fact that it involves a richer inner structure. While substance is a category of essence that proceeds according to the logic of reflection, with its duality of positing and presupposing, the concept deploys a more complex, that is, triple logical structural duality, triple structure, in which every moment is an inseparable articulation of the universal, the particular, and the singular. For Hegel, the concept is originally not an abstract representation that subsumes various items under it. It is rather the inner principle, or, as Hegel says, the soul of concrete which it inhabits. Hegel, that is, thinks it organologically, as Horstmann puts it, following the model of the genus and its species, so that the universal is not limited by its determinate particular, but is manifested in it. Accordingly, Hegel also describes the relationship of the universal to its particular in Spinozian terms of free power and free love at infinite beatitudes, Glückseligkeit, Seligkeit. Next, to articulate this relationship more closely, Hegel introduces the device called totale Reflexion, or Doppelschein, which in my view constitutes the operational matrix and one of the most decisive, if often neglected, innovations in the logic of the concept. I quote, "For this determinacy, as it is in the concept, is a total reflection, a doubly reflective shine," this is the Giovanni's translation, "both outwards as reflection into the other and inwards as reflection into oneself." So what is Doppelschein? The doubly reflective shine is still a reflection, I would say, a version of negative relation to itself as presented under the heading of absolute reflection. However, while in the realm of essence, its outward and inward movements were separated, consecutive, so to speak, which prevented the positing reflection from effectively positing anything at all. It doesn't posit anything at all. In the realm of the concept, its movements occur simultaneously, outward and inward. In outward shine, the doubly reflective shine operates as a simple reflection. In it, that is, the universal concept determines itself in a negative relation to the other and posits its distinction, according to the formula negatio determinatio. But since its outward shine is always accompanied by an inward one, the universal remains present in its particular. It is the inner principle of the latter's distinctions. Next, following the model of doubly reflective shine, the concept can be said to posit its distinctions or determinations or differences immanently, This is its structural role. It is here to think the relation between universal and particular. But as every moment of the concept is an inseparable unity of the universal, the particular, and the singular, these distinctions now obtain a self-identity that makes them fixed, isolated, that is, abstract determinations, according to Hegel. According to Hegel, this is where finitude begins, where he says the concept is outside itself. Since it is the concept itself that here comes out itself, this abstract universality belongs to the concept as its own, says Hegel. Indeed, far from being something bad to be rejected, to be overcome, abstraction constitutes in Hegel's view, I quote, the condition, or rather the essential moment of reason. Let us say, it constitutes the infrastructure of every determinacy. It is only at this point, when this outwardly reflective shine returns back to the universal, that a decisive bifurcation, we can say, opens up. A bifurcation that leads in two opposite directions, that leads either to the abstract universality or to the singularity on the other side. The first way that according to Hegel, abandons the truth is the way of abstraction. But this is another abstraction, this is important. This is an abstraction that abstracts again from the original abstraction and raises the particular determinacy to what Hegel calls conceptless concept, the begrifflose Begriff. It is in this way that the usual abstract universal is produced. But this is one way, the way that abandons the truth, the way from particularity, from the outward reflection that generates abstract determinacy, or determinacy as such, that is originally abstract. The other way, and this is the way of the truth then, if the first one abandons the truth, is the way of the concept. In it, the abstract determinacy, what happens there? It happens there that the abstract determinacy is explicitly posited as such, that is, as singular. And Hegel says, I quote, "Through singularity, as it is therein in itself, the concept gets outside itself and steps into the actuality. Abstraction, which, as the soul of the singularity, is a relation of the negative to the negative, is, as we have seen, nothing external to the universal and the particular, but is immanent in them. And through it, these become something concrete, a content, a singular. The determining of the particular occurs only through singularity, for singularity is that abstraction which, precisely as singularity, is now posited abstraction, gesetzte Abstraktion." Two important comments are required here. First, far from abandoning abstraction, the singular rather reconstitutes the concept by fully embracing it, the abstraction, as its own. For Hegel, then, singularity is radicalization of abstraction, an abstraction that is now posited as such. I quote, "The abstraction of the singular is the first positing of differences as self-subsisting, reflected in themselves. A concrete universal, then, does not exclude abstraction. Quite the contrary, it is a singular, a posited abstraction." And let me add that, in my view, this moment of the gesetzte Abstraktion, where the concept steps into actuality, comes out of itself, corresponds to what Hegel calls turning point of the method, Wendepunkt der Methode, that Hegel speaks about at the end of the science of the logic. And a certain point, Wendungspunkt des Begriffs, if I recall it correctly. But this is a first comment. Second, with the singular, the entire model of self-determining makes a full circle and finally reaches its source. Insofar as it implies activity, self-determination requires an actually existing subject in which it originates. The determining of the particular occurs only through singularity, Hegel affirms. While in formal logic, an individual only falls under its universal, in Hegel, the singular actively brings itself under it. By determining itself, it determines its universal. The singular is the effort to make its particularity, its determinacy, universal. Or, and there is an explicit formulation in Hegel in Encyclopedia where Hegel says, the actual is a singular that through particularity elevates itself into universality and makes itself identical with itself. So, the actual is a singular that through particularity elevates itself into universality. Now that it is only in this way that complete determination, das bestimmte, as Hegel says, can ever be reached. If we were to explain something using the logic of reflection by providing externally determining grounds, every given reason would require another reason. Here, an attempt at complete explanation would inevitably fail. In the logic of the concept, however, self-determination is its own ground and, therefore, needs no additional reason. The singular can provide complete justification because it is a subject. In sum, the concept is, I would say, a bidirectional logical interface of the universal and the singular, the Doppelschein, through which they can obtain their determinacy and sustain the contradiction involved in it. It is in this sense that Hegel describes the I as the pure concept that has come into the determinate existence. However, if this were the whole story, we would end up in a situation where only a very narrow segment of entities would have self-identity and would exist as such. According to this account, that is, singularity implies actively bringing itself under its universal. And this can be found only in those entities that display subjectivity, such as I and spirit, and I'm undecided about it, the living beings. Singularity pertains only to the concrete universal, which instantiate their own concepts. If this is so, then what about those lesser things that are without their own concept, that are not singulars? Are they merely an amorphous manifold, or what? Without going into detail, I will say that there are two kinds of finite entities in Hegel. One includes those that instantiate their own concept, such as concrete universals, subjects, posited abstractions, singulars. These are endowed with an inner principle of their determinations. The other kind is constituted by those lesser things that are without their own concept and whose identity is borrowed. These things are contingent assemblies brought into existence externally by being pointed at, I would say, durch das Demonstrieren, Hegel says. However, since in the realm of the concept, self-identity has the form of universality, even this borrowed identity renders them imperishable, in a sense. Despite lacking a concept of their own, they are therefore not nothing, as Hegel observes in his beautiful letter to Zdravko. And to distinguish them from proper singulars, these lesser entities can well be called individuals, so that at the end we have this duality of singulars and individuals. And Krug's pen wouldn't be singular, but individual. Okay, this is about his metaphysical system, and at the end, briefly, the presentation of the relation between subject and substance in ethical or political field, but since we are rather late, very, very briefly. First, Hegel's conception of ethical life articulates the relationship between universal ethical substance and individual subjects. It is designed to secure the rights of both. The principle of modern states, Hegel says, has enormous strength and depth because it allows the principle of subjectivity to attain its fulfillment in the self-sufficient extreme of personal particularity, while at the same time bringing it back to substantial unity. We have subject and substance, the rights of both. And there is a development at the beginning of the Sittlichkeit where he specifies the relation more closely. It is often argued, however, that Hegel's mature conception of ethical life in general and the state in particular effectively suppresses individual freedom. Well, it is true that with civil society, Hegel provides a special sphere in which one's particularity enjoys the right, I quote, to develop and express itself in all directions, unquote. Therein, particularity is barred from universality, separated from universality, limited to one's selfish interest only, and not intended to rise to universality. In a relation to the universal, that is, within the state, on the contrary, the individual subject is rather reduced to a mere accident of the substance without any independent ground of its own. This is the very often usual reading of the relation. In relation to the subject, the objection continues. The ethical substance and its laws and powers, quoting Hegel, enjoy this privilege that, I quote, they are, in the supreme sense of independence, even more than the hill, the mountains, and so on. What is more, the subject sees the ethical substance, I quote, as its own essence, in which it has its self-feeling, Selbstgefühl. And Hegel describes this relationship as, I quote, immediately even more identical, identischer, than even faith and trust. And since faith and trust is used by Protestants to describe their relationship with God, and Hegel was Protestant, of course, this can only mean that the subject dissolves into ethical substance and indeed enjoys no independence against ethical substance, the objection concludes. I think, however, that this is false. To see why, the objection misses the point. Why? To see why, let us compare the ethical substance to the customs and traditions of a given community, or we could use also a language, I think, in the same way. These mores have an independent objectivity that can be described as such. At the same time, however, they continue to exist only to the extent, these mores, in which individual community members acknowledge them as their own and continue to practice them. If they stop participating in them, the mores gradually, what happens to them? They die out, ending up in folklore festivals performed by professionals with no intimate relation to it. To repeat them mechanically already identically, already leads to their ossification, to the loss of their animating spirit, and thus to their demise. In this sense, the alterations introduced by the practicing individuals rather testify to their vigor. Even a direct effort to transform them profoundly is a sign of their continual relevance. Sometimes they can stay alive only thanks to the hatred of those who persist in opposing them. This is a way to stay alive. They die out only by not being taken seriously any longer, when no one cares for them anymore. This is how they die out. Fighting against them is already a sign of life. And since an individual has become what she is only through these mores, it is logically impossible for her to negate them. Whatever she does on the basis of these mores. By negating them, then they are rather affirmed and vivified. And I think that the same model applies to the relation of an individual subject to ethical substance in Hegel. Hegel's ethical substance does not coincide with itself completely, but allows for certain self-distance in which an independent subject can find her place. What is more, it is precisely by her deviating from it, by attempting to modify it, that the ethical substance and the states are vivified, invigorated, in fact. Okay, this is just as a proposal how to read. I will stop here. And to conclude the sketch, let me just randomly list some questions that have come up along the way. So, singularity and individuality. How far does the concept extend? What is an instantiation of concept? Do living beings instantiate their concepts or not? They do, of course, but are they singulars? This is the question, in my view. How to distinguish between particularity and singularity? This is also the question. What exactly is singularity also, why exactly is singularity also the loss of the concept that Hegel's Verlust des Begriffs? And the concept comes outside itself two times. This is also interesting. First, in the original abstraction, and then in second abstraction, where it is gesetzte Abstraktion. How do they relate to each other? How to think that this inner externality involved in the singular, because it is the concept itself that comes outside itself. How to account for the determinacy of the individual and not the singular. What kind of self-identity it has. What role does singularity play in the theory of action? Or, in particular, what is the place of evil in determining the singularity? Because Hegel says it is only through evil that one singularizes, is Vereinzelheit. And if this is the case, what conception of reason this implies? Because in this sense, then, there must be some intransparency inside the reason itself. And what kind of absolute this implied? Meaning, what kind of absolute is needed to make a room inside itself for independent singular? Because this is what we started from. And then, how to think free release, das Entlassen, to allow for the independent existence of the both individuals and singulars, to think it as an extension of self-externalization, meaning to externalize itself, but this is then continued self-extension, or to use another model to think it as a, let's say, self-subtraction, the removal of the absolute from the positivity. Then subject state. And when we speak about state, how to think the monarch, the figure of a monarch, which is probably the exemplary, I would say, singular. But, okay, is a singular? If it is, I think it is, but then why? And, okay, we could continue history, art. There is a lot of questions that opens here, but you're here to give some tentative answer. Thank you.
Go to Georgios then, and then we move the discussion to coffee break. Yeah, okay, because we're, yeah.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank my friends Zdravko, Bojana, and Martin for having me here and for doing all these things for me. And then I have to say that the argument for bringing me here was that I have written my PhD on individuality in Hegel's philosophy of right. And that was 30 years ago, and I'm not sure I have found any solution for the problem, and that's why I didn't publish it. I mean, you don't have to publish it if you do it in France. And, well, but I made some thoughts afterwards, and maybe it's a little better now than it was at that time. Okay. An interpretation is based on a text and must make sense. It takes both. If we focus too much on the text, we lose track of the argument. If we rely too much on the argument, we no longer talk about the text. Here I shall take the risk of leaning more toward reconstruction by proposing 10 theses. I do this for two reasons. One reason is the lack of time. That's why I declare from the outset that following Lebrun, Fulda, and Francesco Berto, I think that Hegel's intention is to reconstruct philosophical concepts, and that his logic is not an ontology, but a semantics. The second reason is that Hegel does not clarify his methodological presuppositions. On what grounds is he saying, for example, such absurd things as that the genus has only two species, which are the genus again and the species? Hegel claims to begin the logic without presuppositions, but in fact he begins by clearing the ground of the prejudices that encumber it in the phenomenology. And here he already uses the method of the logic. Okay. If we try nonetheless to summarize the result of the phenomenology, we may say it concludes that we cannot think the subject and the object without each other, because the reduction of the one to the other in either direction leads to absurdities. I mean, craniology, phrenology, or utility. My first thesis generalizes this idea. Semantics is governed by opposition. Therefore, for a term to have a determined meaning, it is necessary, A, either that this term is contained in an opposition, B, or that this term contains an opposition. In one case, the opposition is external. The term to which it gives meaning is an opposite. In the phenomenology, the subject and the object are assumed to be independent and turn out to be opposites, deriving their meaning from each other. In the other case, the opposition is internal to the term in question. This term forms a whole. We can also say, I think, that it is real. For Hegel, the category of reality designates an independent whole composed of non-independent moments. Let us consider here, following a suggestion by Jean-Paul Dumont, Introduction à la méthode d'Aristote, the analysis of substance as a whole, synolon, of matter and form in Aristotle. Form and matter have their meaning by contrast with each other. Substance is defined by this internal opposition. I think Hegel extends this structure to everything conceivable. That's a proposition, okay. Hence my second thesis. A term is called particular if it has a meaning only in opposition to an opposite term, and universal if it has a meaning independently of an opposite term. According to thesis 1, the universal must necessarily contain an opposition, otherwise it will have no meaning. When this necessity is taken into account in its definition, the universal is designated, and that's the problem, as singular. If a term is contained in an opposition, both opposites are determined as particular, regardless of our intention when we use them. If a term contains an opposition, both opposites contained in it are determined as particular, but this very term, their framework, is universal. Therefore, there must be two meanings of the universal, a false and a true one. According to the first, the universal is supposed to be foreign to any form of opposition. According to the second, it has no opposite, but contains an opposition. Hegel designates, I think, the universal in the first case as abstract, and in the second as concrete. In the exposition of the concept in the logic, the universal tout court designates the abstract or false universal, and the concrete or true universal is designated as singular. Why? This will be the subject of our fourth thesis, which must be preceded by the following third one. Third, Abstract universal is a contradictory expression used to criticize the claim of an opposite to be universal. The abstract universal appears to have no meaning since it is supposed not to be an opposite and not to contain an opposition. But it does have a meaning because in fact it is an opposite. However, this is not the meaning it was supposed to have. Two opposing expressions designate two particular terms. The abstract universal is particular, contrary to what it is supposed to be. Abstract universal is a contradictory expression. To characterize a term in this way is therefore to criticize it. This is the case with subsumption, as Zdravko emphasized. When we think of the universal as that which subsumes the particular, we are in fact thinking of a particular. Let's take an example. Being subsumes everything. It is a category of maximum extension. But extension is inversely proportional to intension. Therefore, being is without content and can only have meaning in opposition to a content. Therefore, it is a particular. Hegel says being is determined as indeterminate, which means I take it to mean that to be non-particular is his particularity. It is the most abstract category. It is not the most universal one, in Hegel's view. The concrete universal is not opposed to anything else, but it has a determinate meaning because it contains an opposition. What form does this opposition take? In an opposition, the meaning on one side must be the negation of the meaning of the other. If one has a determination, the other will have the determination of not having this determination. It will be determined as indeterminate. It will therefore be an abstract universal. In short, the concrete universal contains the opposition of the abstract universal and the particular. I think this is why Hegel says that the genus has two species, the genus and the species. Here, in the logic, he says that the singular contains the opposition of the universal and the particular, the concrete, the abstract, and the particular. The problem is that the singular is not a concept. On the other hand, if a concept can express a singular, then we can say this concept is singular. I think concrete universal is singular in that sense. That's my proposition. Hence, the fourth thesis, the singular concept accounts for realities outside the semantic field. That is to say, what is studied by the philosophy of the real, the natural and human world, and which does not belong to the logic. Okay, that's the thesis. For Aristotle, what truly is the ousia is singular. But our concepts are general. They are universal or particular, not singular. On the other hand, he thinks of substance as a whole of matter and form. As we said, a singular is therefore conceivable. Why not call this a singular concept? I think this is precisely what Hegel does. For him, true and false definitions of the concept seem to separate on this point when he states, I quote, "Here's where the false start is made that makes abstraction stray away from the way of the concept, abandoning the truth. Its higher and highest universal to which it rises is only a surface that becomes progressively more void of content. The singularity which it despises is the depth in which the concept grasps itself and where it is posited as a concept." End of quote. The singular is despised when we demand in vain to subsume it under a concept. It is honored when we detect an opposition there, because we can then conceive of it. We then attribute to it a structure that is that of the concept. We can say that the concept is then posited as a concept. It is wrong to despise the singular, which is supposed to be too small to be of interest to the concept, as Parmenides points out to Socrates according to Plato. It's a nice spot in this dialogue. Adorno is wrong to believe that Hegel despises the non-conceptual negative dialectic. Rather, I assume that he is criticizing a definition of the concept that forces us to consider the singular inaccessible, and that he defines the concept as a process of conceptual analysis of the singular. Since semantics is the domain governed by opposition, the universal is abstract when it fails to extract itself from this domain. It is concrete when it allows us to think of real things, which are not opposites. We have access to reality if we distinguish in it, by thought, opposing aspects which have a meaning, one in opposition to the other, and one of which falsely claims to be the whole, the abstract universal. These remarks lead us to the fifth thesis. One of the opposites contained in the meaning of a term is always the same meaning, but in its unilateral form, which is open to criticism because it is an opposite instead of containing the opposition. A term, therefore, has two meanings, as opposed to another term, as not opposed to this term, but containing it. And the passage from one to the other, therefore, modifies the meaning of the term. Now, there is one instance where Hegel clearly distinguishes between the two meanings of the same term. The true or good infinite is distinct from the false or bad infinite, as he calls them. They don't have, he says, the same meaning. Indeed, the false one is the infinite opposed to the finite, whereas the true infinite contains the opposition of the false infinite and the finite. The false infinite is false because it claims to encompass everything, but it does not encompass the finite since it defines itself in opposition to it. Consequently, it is finite. The true infinite is true because it has no opposite. It includes within itself the infinite in its finite form, as well as the finite opposed to the latter. If we replace infinite with universal and finite with particular, we have the general case, I think. Opposites are finite because they are particular. The one that claims not to be finite and therefore particular, not particular, is just like the other because it is an opposite. True infinity is the universal that contains this opposition. It has a different meaning. It is singular. The singular contains the opposition of the universal and the particular because a term has the meaning of being universal only if it is the whole of itself in abstract form and of the particular. Remember the genus, okay. So far the singular is the coherent form of the universal. Hegel states that the identity of identity and non-identity is the simplest definition of the absolute. This can be understood in the same way. That which does not derive its meaning from an opposition to which it belongs is not semantically relative to something else, but absolute. This absoluteness is due to the fact that this meaning contains its opposition to its opposite. In this way, its existence does not depend on a meaning that is foreign to it. The identity opposed to difference is relative. Identity which contains within itself both identity and difference is absolute. It's a coherent version of identity. However, if the true infinite, the concrete universal or second-order identity do not have the same meaning as, respectively, the false infinite, the abstract universal, or the identity opposed to difference, why do we say that they are the whole and their own moment? What is the link between the two? I think it is intention. False infinite, abstract universal, first-order identity are supposed not to have an opposite, but they do. On the other hand, why do we say that second-order identity mediated by difference is a singular? This is again a question of intention, I think. The concept must enable us to know reality, which appears in the form of singular beings. For example, see the beginning of the phenomenology. Everything is singular. A concept that gives access appears as a singular. Okay. A concept that gives access to the real may thus be called singular. My sixth thesis concerns this aspect of the concept. Instead of being reduced to the conceptual, the real is conceived if it is reconstructed as containing the opposition of two particular terms, one of which claims to be universal. The real is conceived as the relation to itself of this latter term through its opposition to the other, that is to say, as the modified meaning of the universal opposed to the particular. For sure, this is not the usual sense of universals. But the singular also changes meaning. It must be something that relates to itself, as you said. Thus, not every piece of the world is a singular. That which contains its opposite relates to itself by means of the opposite. It is the whole and its own moment. Reality can only be understood if it can be reconstructed in this way, in my opinion. A set of things is a singular if it is self-related. An animal judges everything from the point of view of its self-conservation. It relates to itself in everything. A human knows things. She examines everything from its own point of view. She is par excellence the whole and its own moment, since she allows the opposite to possess the same structure. The real is not always living or thinking, but that which lives and that which thinks is more conceivable than the rest, I think, because it is more singular. According to Hegel, the dialectic of infinity leads to the category of being for itself. In Aristotle, kathauto, the origin of the German expression für sich, or per se in Latin, designates the names of substance, insofar as they do not need anything other than themselves in order to be able to be said what they are said. This is from Aristotle scholar Anne-Marie Dillens. For itself is that which is self-related. Its immediate form is the atom or the monad, which is not defined by opposition. Similarly, the concrete universal is singular because it expresses self-relation and is therefore not defined by opposition. Hegel asserts that life, mind, God, as well as the pure concept, are beyond the grasp of abstraction, for abstraction keeps singularity away from its products, and singularity is the principle of individuality and personality. And so it comes to nothing but universalities void of life, mind, and content. If one thinks in terms of external oppositions, she does not have access to the content of reality, which is non-opposed, even more so if it is living or thinking. The infinite relates to itself as true infinite by means of the sphere of the finite, which is characterized by the opposition of the false infinite and the finite. Similarly, the universal relates to itself as singular through the sphere of particular, which is characterized by the opposition of the universal and the particular. The singular is a return to itself of the universal, as Hegel says. We can say that the singular is a meaning that is the whole and its own moment. A question then arises. I make many objections to myself. Is only the infinite, the universal, identity, the whole and its own moment? Can't we say the same thing about the finite, the particular, and difference? I think yes, but in another meaning. Seventh, opposites contain each other semantically. An opposite is defined as the negation of its opposite. It therefore contains the meaning of the opposite. This is valid on both sides, symmetrically. But neither of these inclusions of the opposite accounts for the relationship between a determination of thought and the opposition it contains. The forms of the concept, universal, particular, singular, are related as subject and predicate in judgment. According to Blanchet, a French specialist of Aristotle's logic, Aristotle prefers inherence when the subject is a substance and subsumption when it is a concept. This is understandable. The attribute is an accident of the singular substance. It is inherent to it. A particular concept is a case of a more extended concept. It is subsumed in it, by it. We find this distinction in Hegel too. In the judgments of existence, which determine a being, the predicate is inherent in the latter. In the judgments of reflection, which account for the relation between predicates, one predicate is subsumed under the other. In inherence, the subject includes a predicate. In subsumption, the predicate includes a subject. The judgment of necessity and the judgment of the concept will be neither judgments of inherence nor judgments of subsumption. What do we need then? Eighth thesis. The structure of to be the whole and its own moment has two distinct meanings. Each of the opposing meanings refers to the other as that without which it would not exist as this determined meaning in order to negate it. It is itself because it is not the other. B, the meaning that contains an opposition does not need an opposing meaning. In it, its own meaning in a unilateral form and the opposing meaning are opposed. It is itself insofar as it is also the other. In one case it's not the other, in the other case it is the other. Here the semantic modification takes on its full importance. The meaning of the whole differs from that of the two opposites with which one intends to say the same thing as it, because henceforth it is itself insofar as it is the other. In doing so, the meaning of the opposite with which one intended to say the whole has been modified. Before this modification, the other opposite reigned over the opposition. In the external opposition, the term that expresses what it means for a term to be an opposite is not defective. In the finite, let's remind us, in the finite infinite opposition, both are defined as finite. Difference and identity are initially different things. And the universal opposed to the particular is a particular. So the particular expresses what it is to be an opposite. The particular is itself because it is not the other. Hegel says that the universal and the particular are initially two species of the particular. It's the sense of logic. Before the production of the new meaning of the term which claims to account for the two opposites, it was the other term which accounted for both of them. But in doing so, it made universal impossible. If the infinite is non-finite, we are condemned to move from one to the other indefinitely, according to Hegel. It is tautological to say that identity and difference are different. If the universal is non-particular, it abstracts from all content and thus cannot account for any content. Case A is therefore contained within case B. Between the two opposing terms, only the one which denies the opposition can include it, but it is at the cost of modifying its meaning. Hence, our ninth thesis, to define the universal as something other than a particular, it must be defined not as the negation of the particular, but as the invalidation of the opposition universal-particular. What contains an opposition is the whole and its own moment insofar as it is the whole of the preceding opposition. This applies only to the opposite that negates the opposition. This term no longer has the same meaning because it does not submit to the relationship of mutual negation. The second meaning of the structure, being the whole and its own moment, designates the framework in which the mutual negation of opposites take place. This explains the passage from one category to the next, because this framework is not really absolute. It is absolute as far as the opposites it contains are concerned. Most of the time, it is itself an opposite from another higher point of view. For example, now we go to politics and to the end. The framework of the opposition of just and unjust is justice, which is the higher form of just, insofar it is not defined in opposition to unjust, but accounts for both just and unjust. This framework is also one side of a higher opposition, which is part of a higher framework. For Hegel, justice as abstract right is opposed to morality, an opposition inserted into the framework of Sittlichkeit, inside which an action can be either just or moral. And this brings us to our 10th thesis, a political one. A private person is a particular because they are opposed to other private persons. A citizen is a singular because they are the same as other citizens. Here I try to apply our framework to another triad, the one internal to ethicity: family, civil society, the state. Civil society, a modern sphere dedicated to the principle of particularity, is opposed to family. In family, particular interests are subordinated to the common interest. In civil society, the common is at the service of the particular. Family embodies a unilateral submission to the general interest. There are no individuals within it, just as there are none in a despotic state or in Plato's Republic, which is like an extended family, as Aristotle already notes. The individual is the dissolution of the family, says Hegel. Civil society is the loss of ethical life, the natural form of which is family. It is the dissolution of the concept in its independent moments, says he. In civil society, there are private persons, bearers of particular interests. This is the individual that the family lacks. Family and civil society are in conflict, and the state is the whole where this opposition of universal and particular takes place. In civil society, the abstract universal and the particular exist both only through each other and for each other, as Hegel says. If we now turn to our reconstruction, we can say that the state is a return of the family to itself in a form that is no longer unilateral and has another meaning. It is the whole and its own moment. This moment is the family, which is itself the whole and its own moment, but not in the same way, because the family is not its other, civil society, whereas the state is its other. It contains families and the civil society. Family is an abstract universal, a particular. The state is a concrete universal, a singular. Now, the fact that the state and not civil society is the locus of the singular may surprise us, since, as Hegel emphasizes, the individual in the natural sense of a bearer of needs appears as such in civil society. This makes sense when we took into account the fact that for him, the same person is both a private person and a citizen. This is after the Wende in 1805. As a bearer of particular interests, I am opposed to others. As a singular, I am not part of an opposition. As a bourgeois, I am a particular. As a citoyen, I am a singular. A similar surprise is provoked by the fact that for Hegel, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, is the moment of the particular, while the spirit of the community is the moment of the singular. A characteristic common to believers and citizens is likely to shed light on this strange assertion. Members of the church are ready to suffer martyrdom to bear witness to the spirit. Members of the state are ready to sacrifice their particular interest and even their life, the entirety of their individuality, out of patriotism, a term defined as the political disposition and may be borrowed from the French Revolution, because it took another meaning afterwards, but at the time it still has the meaning it has in the French Revolution. A patriot is a revolutionary in a French Revolution. Okay? This doesn't mean that the singular should mortify themselves like the unhappy early Christians. They are not opposed to the particular, but not to be opposed to is to be free from. They need not repress it. They should just be ready to do without it. To be able to sacrifice oneself as a bearer of particular interest is what Hegel calls the ethical aspect of war, which is very discussed, of course. But in my opinion, at the same time, it is the revolutionary moment of his thought, the absence of which Marx seems to deplore in Feuerbach, first thesis. In conclusion, let me suggest why self-sacrifice is important for the concept of singularity. The state is no natural unity. It is neither the result of a social contract. If this were the case, the state would be reduced to a tool in the hands of private interests. It would be a particular. If the state is not natural nor conventional, what is it? Here comes the big word. It is historical. But what is a historical deed? A historical deed demands that I can place my freedom above my life. In doing this, for example, during a revolution, I behave as a singular. Hegel says a constitution is not to be seen as something we can do and undo, ein Gemachtes. Is he thus extending the concept of Physei to Thesei, i.e., is he naturalizing something that is a convention, as Adorno accuses him to do? I think no. He has in view the concept of history. In the philosophy of right, history as a concept is the full meaning of the concept of state. History is the production of a free political community, the members of which are more than just individuals. They are singulars. Voilà.